That was fabulous. Dear God, thank you for beauty in all its forms and the sublime way it touches us and moves us and changes us and steadied us too. Amen. This summer I preached a number of sermons on King David. Bunny Oliver preached one too. And stories of King David fill the lectionary every third summer. They come around every 3 years. And this summer I decided to look at stories from the life of David that the lectionary skips over. It's like this rich trove of stories. And so a few weeks ago I did one on Abigail, David and Abigail, and last week was about Uzzah the Unlucky. Remember him? Reached out to steady the ark and got zapped. Well, 3 summers ago, I gave you my analysis of the famous story where David takes another man's wife for his own. That one is in the lectionary. That man was one of David's generals, Uriah the Hittite, and the wife of Uriah was, remember, Bathsheba. And you may remember that Bathsheba became pregnant with David's child, and that's when things got really interesting. One thing led to another, and as often happens with shady dealings, well, it led to a murder. David, you may remember, had Uriah, her husband, killed in battle. Really slimy. Well, what happens next is left out of the lectionary, but I find it too interesting to ignore, and it's kind of a prelude to the rest of what I want to talk about today. The child of that union is born, and right away the question is, will it survive? The poor little guy looks kind of peaked. He just doesn't look right. Well, David prays desperately to God for the little boy. He fasts, he refuses to do press conferences, he stops making public appearances, he sleeps on the floor. The elders in the court and members of his family are summoned. They try to get him off the floor, but he won't budge, nor can they get him to eat a single thing. This goes on for a long time. On the 7th day, the child dies. David's servants are afraid to tell him. They say, "What should we do now? While there was yet hope the child might live, he wouldn't listen to a word we said. And now there's no telling what he's going to do." And here's how the story plays out. David noticed that the servants were whispering behind his back and realized that the boy must have died. He asked the servants, "Is the boy dead?" Yes, they answered, "He's dead." So David got up off the floor, washed his face, combed his hair, put on a fresh change of clothes, then went into the sanctuary and worshiped. Then he came home and asked for something to eat. They gave him pot roast and carrots and yellow onions, and he ate it like a starving man. And so his servants asked him, "What's going on with you? While the child was alive, you fasted, wept, stayed up all night. Now that he's dead, you get up and eat." And David said, "Well, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, thinking God might have mercy on me and the child would live. But now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back?" Now, I want to begin with that story because it's so indicative of the peculiar character of David. He's a murderer, yes, and yet he is so human, and in some positive ways too. He's very much his own man. And he's also so transparent. In some ways, you might say he's kind of godly, but it's still clear that he has to be watched every moment. Like you, I imagine I have this soft spot in my heart for individuals who are their own person, who speak truth even when it doesn't serve them. This election season, I find myself missing John McCain. I'll never forget that town hall when he was running for president back in 2008. And a woman stood up and repeated some nonsense she'd heard on Fox News. She said, "We know Barack Obama is an Arab." And John McCain didn't hesitate. He said, "No, ma'am, he's not. He's a decent family man, a citizen of the USA that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues." Now, as we all know from recent history, it might have helped him to agree with that deluded woman. But John McCain, God bless him, was not willing to sell his soul, nor base his presidential campaign on a lie. That's integrity. So let's go back in time a bit in the saga of David to this morning's text. It's a story from the early years of David's reign, the story of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, that's easy for me to say. Mephibosheth was only 5 years old when news came that his father Jonathan and his grandfather King Saul had both been killed in battle. Terrified that the little boy might be next, his nurse snatches him up in her arms and starts to run off with him to hide him somewhere. He's the heir apparent, of course, and everyone knows you have to protect the prince. Well, she was in such a panic, she tripped and fell, and the boy was badly crippled, so badly he never walked normally again. Well, David, a powerful warlord at this time, steps into the gap because by the deaths of the boy's grandfather Saul and his father Jonathan, he's going to be king. And you know, the first thing a new king usually does is consolidate his power and make sure that any surviving claimants to the throne are taken care of one way or another, often permanently. I mean, it's standard procedure to wipe out your predecessor's entire family when you come to the throne, just in case any of them happen to have political ambitions. But maybe because Mephibosheth was compromised in the mobility department, or maybe because his father Jonathan had once been David's best friend, or maybe because of a combination of these things, David decides to be generous. David, let's face it, is a very complex man. In fact, treating Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, with maximum grace and favor is just the kind of crazy gesture David likes to make every once in a while. Like the time a few of his soldiers risked their necks, breaking through enemy lines to bring him a cup of cool water from Bethlehem, David's hometown. And David won the hearts of everybody by saying, "Shall I drink the blood of you men who gathered this flagon of water at the risk of your own lives?" And he poured the water on the ground. Anyway, he had his servants bring Mephibosheth before him. And the poor 5-year-old fell on his face in terror, sure that this meant his execution. But David told him not to be afraid. David told him that he, Mephibosheth, was to have all the property that rightfully belonged to him, property that had been his father's and grandfather's. Yes, and a man named Ziba, a servant, would look after him. And he also promised him that from then on, he was to take all his meals at the king's table, as if he was David's own son, which makes this quite a moment. Now, you can't underestimate the significance of such a gesture. I mean, first, this is a clear way for David to keep an eye on the young man who will continue to have a legitimate claim on the throne. But it will also mean that Mephibosheth will never be a stranger to the king, which may explain David's behavior later. Here's what I mean. Remember this guy named Ziba, who's a servant. Well, he is a sly one, as it turns out. And years later, when there's a revolt against David, perpetrated by David's own son, Absalom, Ziba would tell David that Mephibosheth, little Mephibosheth, who's grown up, had defected to the other side, that he claimed he'd become a rebel like Absalom. Well, what motivated Ziba was the hope that David would grant him not only his favor, but also cede him all of Mephibosheth's real estate. And so David, without first ordering a thorough investigation, gives Ziba everything that belongs to Mephibosheth, just everything. It's weird, though, that David would do such a thing. David is a wise and discerning leader. If any king of Israel knew when he was being played, well, it would have been David. But let's not forget that this happens in the direct aftermath of his being betrayed by his favorite son, Absalom, and also hearing that Absalom had been killed. What I'm saying here is that David is a mess emotionally at this moment. Next thing that happens, Mephibosheth shows up and makes an eloquent case to David that Ziba, that servant, has been lying. In fact, Mephibosheth shows up with his beard untrimmed and his hair in a royal tangle, saying that he had been so anxious about David's safety during this revolt that he was frozen in place and couldn't flee with the king to a place of safety. He couldn't even comb his hair, he said. He'd been on the king's side all along. And David doesn't know quite who to believe. Poor David is so shattered by everything that's happened that he can't give the matter his full attention, let alone his genius for things political. So he tells Mephibosheth that he's rescinding his original order and that he and Ziba can just divide the real estate between them 50-50. What's clear here is that David, the great king, the man of usual sound judgment, is compromised. He's only hitting on one, maybe two cylinders at best. Though he can't not be king, he still has to pronounce judgments, and because of all that's happened, he'd actually like the whole world to just go away. Maybe you know what that feels like. Maybe you've been there yourself at some time before. Most days, you and I, we're ready and able to deal with life as it comes to us, even in a pinch. Even when something comes out of left field, we can summon up our best or our next to best. But there are times when that's just not possible because of an illness or a trauma or who knows what. And we become like little children when it comes to making a judgment about something important. Maybe it's after somebody has betrayed us that we love. Well, before David has a chance to move on, Mephibosheth says that he's overjoyed that David has driven the rebels out and come through the battle safe and sound, and that to celebrate, he is prepared to give Ziba, his old conniving servant, all thousands of his acres that once belonged to him and the ranch house too. Now, whether or not he made good on that offer or meant to hardly matters. It was a crazy and magnificent gesture to make, and one wonders if David was maybe just too lost in his own grief to realize, however dimly, what a remarkable young man Mephibosheth must have been. Or I wonder if maybe it wasn't the trauma. That maybe David had just reached the age when he no longer felt he had to control everything or even could anymore. Maybe he no longer trusted he was always the guy in the room with the best ideas. That can happen, especially when your own son has turned on you. Maybe he had come to accept the complexities of life, that the world changes, and you just aren't going to understand everything forever. Think of Joe Biden. He pulled off that prisoner exchange he'd been working on for months, maybe years, involving 7 or was it 8 different countries, but had to finally accept that he was maybe too old and that for his party to have any chance at all in November, he needed to step aside. The Bible doesn't tell us who was telling the truth that day in Old Jerusalem, Ziba or Mephibosheth. We never find out. We don't know anything at all about Ziba, really. And though we have Mephibosheth's backstory, we just don't have full entry into his heart. The biblical narrator just gives us the young man's verbal account and a picture of the state of his apparent lack of hygiene. We know that when he was very tiny, he lost a father and a grandfather on the same day. We know that on that same day, he also became crippled for life, remember? We know that had it not been for David's generosity, he would be dead. And we know he knows this too. There he sat. Think of it. 2, maybe 3 times a day, eating at the table of a man who benefited mightily from his own personal loss, right? Sitting there with the man himself. What might that do to a young person over a long period of time? He's a bit of an enigma, this crippled prince who was raised to expect more from life, raised to expect a lot more. What must old David have made of him sitting there every day? Fact is, we all live in our own little bubbles. And we should always be humble about what we think we know or don't know about other people. The health of our relationships, depends on this. How we manage in our places of work or with our family members. So let me close this by sharing a poem with you that's dear to me. It's about another enigma. A woman who thought it best to allow a baby she was carrying to be adopted and raised by someone else. It's as strong a wake-up call as I know about the mystery of other people and how it's always best to respect that mystery. The poem is by Ellen Bass, who's a fabulous poet. And the poem's called For My Husband's Birth Mother. The birth mother is the subject of the poem. Ellen, again, addressing her husband, says, "Those months I carried our daughter, Sarah, I'd think of your birth mother, the woman who carried you, though she could not keep you. This woman we did not know, this girl whose life was changed in ways we will never know, who wanted or did not want, who loved or did not love, who chose or did not choose, but willing or reluctant carried you, birthed you. We do not know her name or what she thought as her fingertips soaped her taut belly in the bath. As your kicks reached her, first uncertain, then definite, firm rabbit thumps. We do not know if she could keep food down, if her legs cramped, if she grew dizzy in the grocery, had to drop her head between her knees to keep from blacking out. We do not know if she held you in her hospital bed, if her breasts were bound to keep the milk from letting down, or if they drugged her and she woke only to the new softness of her belly like dough. We do not know what friends or family criticized her, if they sent her out of town and brought her back as though she'd only been on holiday. We know only there was a woman who gave you the food of her blood, the bed of her flesh, who breathed for you. We do not know if anyone ever thanked her.